Hello. Today I am here with my mother, Elizabeth Graf. So first, why don't you introduce yourself?
I am Eleanor's mother, Elizabeth Graf.
Could you give maybe a brief introduction of how you're related to adoption?
Well, I'm related to adoption because first, my sister and her husband adopted their daughter from Romania, and that got me interested in adoption. And I started doing some research, and I discovered that single people could adopt children. And since I wasn't married, I thought that might be a good way for me to build a family on my own. So I started doing some more research, and um, I talked to the uh, owners of the adoption agency that my sister and her husband had used in Kansas, and they said, "Yes, we can work with you as a single parent, and we can help you adopt a child." So that is how I became involved in adoption.
So was it first through your sister that you learned about adoption?
Well, I always knew that adoption was a thing. And I actually had an aunt, one of my mother's older sisters, who had adopted two children who were both a few years older than I was. And we always knew growing up that they were adopted children. So we always knew that adoption was, a way for people to build their families in addition to giving birth to children.
Was that primarily in the context of domestic adoption, or was international adoption something that you knew about as well?
I didn't know about international adoption until I had probably heard of it before my sister had adopted, but I wasn't very familiar with it at that time.
What was the agency that your sister recommended?
It was called Special Editions.
Um, and so you mentioned that you'd spoken with the owner. Do you remember who that was?
I think her name was Deb Scheumann.
And what did you talk about?
Um, Actually, I don't think I worked too much with her. I worked with one of her employees, and when we when we talked about um, adoption, they recommended that um, since I was going to try to adopt as a single parent, that I should try to adopt an infant, a newborn, as young as possible, because because many older children who have been um, either e- either institutionalized or who may have been living with families but in more undesirable conditions, they could have their the belief was that an older child would be more likely to have significant emotional issues, and so they thought that it would be better as a single parent that I try to adopt an infant to um, try to avoid having to cope with those types of issues, because it would be harder as a single parent to have to go through a lot of medical evaluations and a lot of mental health evaluations with a child than it would be if you were married and you had support of someone else to help you with it.
Aside from special editions, did you consider any other adoption agencies?
Actually, I did. Um, Before I finally signed up with special editions, I I went through training in the state of Missouri where I was living at the time to become a foster or adoptive parent in Missouri and to adopt domestically. And after I completed that training, the instructors of those classes who were social workers, they told me that they did not think that I would ever have a child placed with me because I was a single person. And so they recommended that I try to adopt internationally. Even though I had already looked at international adoption, I had thought maybe I would try to adopt a child in need that was local rather than going to an international agency. But they said because there are so many families in the United States that are trying to adopt a child, that they said that I would not ever be considered as an adoptive parent because the waiting list was so long.
Were there any specific other agencies that you looked at?
No, I knew of other agencies. I had done some research on different agencies, but I just went ahead and used the one that my sister had used.
Do you remember what those other agencies were?
Oh, there were dozens and dozens. Before I had moved to Kansas, I lived in Virginia, and so I had started researching agencies back there. Actually, this was while my sister was still in the process of trying to complete their adoption of their daughter, and that took several years to complete. So I was still in Virginia, and I started researching agencies there, but I can't remember the names of any of the agencies. But there were agencies that were based out of Virginia, and then I also joined some online mailing lists for adoption, and I think that I started looking at following a group of families that had adopted um, from Russia and Ukraine, and because I was thinking more of Eastern Europe at that time because Mariana had come from was coming from Romania, and I think that at that point Romania had closed, but Bulgaria and Russia and Ukraine were still open for adoption. So I was kind of looking at that, and then I had looked at multiple. I had joined mailing lists from multiple different countries, so I would read emails from different people who were adopting from all these different countries, and they were all using different agencies. So I learned about a lot of different agencies that were, and some people highly recommended some agencies, and other agencies were not recommended, and some agencies were actually corrupt, and um, you would start to find out about which agencies were not ethical. So I kind of had a pretty good feel by that point of which agencies were ethical and which ones were not.
And special editions passed the test?
Yes, they were considered an ethical agency.
What role, if any, did religion play in your choice to adopt?
It really didn't play any role in my choice to adopt, other than the fact that ever since I was a little kid, I had always worried about children who did not have parents or didn't have families. And it seemed to me like those children were more likely to be in other countries. And in fact, my dad supported an agency called CARE that would send like a little booklet to us every month in the mail. And it had pictures of children, I think mainly from Africa, who were starving. And it would always show photos of them like with flies crawling in their eyes and things like that, and their bellies were extended. And I'd always tell my parents, we need to go adopt these children. We need to get them and feed them and take care of them because no one's taking care of them. So I always felt like I wanted to adopt children who needed homes, and so that came into play as well. But religion wasn't really a part of my thinking.
As you were preparing for the adoption process, what sort of resources did you use?
Well, I had to go through actual training classes through the adoption agency and through the classes that I took in Missouri through the social services agency. And so those resources were required for adoption. And those taught a lot about things like understanding um, that children who have been removed from their birth families, um, they're it's not a golden thing for them. They have tremendous loss, and even if they don't recognize it themselves because they're too young to understand what they have lost, they've still been hurt. It's kind of a primal wound to a child to be removed from her parents, her especially from her own mother, and to be put into an orphanage or even to put into foster care. An orphanage is worse in most cases than foster care, because ideally foster care would be more one-on-one care for a child, but it's still a tremendous loss to the child, and it may be something that a child can never recover from when they've lost that connection to their birth mothers.
Is that a concern that you had with adopting?
It wasn't something that I really fully understood at the time, that and there was more emphasis on understanding that children who have gone through that type of trauma are likely to suffer from conditions like reactive attachment disorder, where they're unable to attach to a primary caregiver, and how destructive that can be to the family that the child is adopted into, and how difficult it can be for the family to live with a child who develops that condition. So there was a lot of emphasis on that, because I think that by the time I was ready to adopt, there was greater recognition that this was a significant issue among adopted children. And there was also a lot of training in recognizing the fact that many children coming out of those type of situations may have been exposed to drugs or alcohol in utero, so they could have significant damage, brain damage, or delays, and plus, again, just overall trauma from having gone through that. So there was a lot of training to try to try to help the adoptive family recognize that when you have adopted a child, um, the child is not going to appear on your doorstep just singing your praises and saying, "I'm so happy that you adopted me and we're going to live happily ever after," because the child and the child doesn't understand what's happening. First of all they know is that they've been removed from a life that they know and that they've become comfortable with, even if it's not an ideal life. They've been taken out of it and moved to a different life. So chances are they're not going to be happy or comfortable when you do that to them. So they want the adoptive parents to recognize that that is going to happen, that you have to understand that your child is going to have to adjust and may never fully adjust.
So, were your sources mostly these classes and people you knew in real life?
No, my sources were the classes, and I read some books. I don't remember which ones I read, but I had a lot of books about adoption and um, child psychology, and also all of the people that I talked to on the mailing list that I had joined.
Did you use any government resources?
No.
Were was that because you didn't know about them or you couldn't access them or
Well, I didn't know of any, and I I don't really think that I would have needed them. I had so much information available to me.
when you or I guess a better way to ask this would be,
Mhm.
were you looking for something in particular with the child you would adopt?
No, I wasn't looking for anything specific. And I actually received information on several different children before I finally fully signed up with special editions to adopt. Well, let me think. This may have been through special editions, but I got information on a child in Bulgaria who was an older child. She was about 11, I think, and she had a lot of physical deformities. She had quite a few physical issues. Um, I think the things that I was looking for is I was hoping to adopt a child who was mentally competent. I guess I could put it that way. Like I didn't want to adopt a child like with Down syndrome who would need care for the rest of her life. I wanted to adopt a child who would be able to eventually be out on her own, and because as a single parent, I wouldn't have the resources to fund the life of a child for beyond my own lifetime, and and I wouldn't have really the resources to take care of a child full time without working full time as well. So so I did look for children who would be able to go to school and who might have um, medical conditions that could be managed, with medication or surgically, but not for children that would have conditions where they would need a full-time caregiver. So those are the only real um, things that I considered.
How much influence did you have on picking the child that you got to adopt?
Well, originally I was I probably could have chosen a child on my own because there were a lot of photo listings back then, especially of children with special needs. They call them waiting children, and so I was looking at a lot of these photo listings and reading their information, and then contacting the agencies and asking for more information on these different children. So I didn't ask for information on, like I said, just that one child that I had looked at from Bulgaria that I was interested in, and maybe two or three others that I had considered that were again older children that I was thinking about you know maybe trying to adopt. And so in terms of that, I had say, and like I could apply to adopt a child. And so after I had looked at, like I said, several children and reviewed their information with special editions with the social worker there, and they pretty much talked me out of adopting these older children, um, because they felt strongly again that it would be too much for me as a single parent to take on all of the issues that an older child was likely to have. And so that was when they turned around and said, "We really think that you should adopt an infant." And they said, so right now, probably the best way for you to adopt an infant would be through our program in Guatemala. And so they said, so we never know when an infant will be available in Guatemala. Basically, if a birth mother decides to surrender a child for adoption, then we'll have a child available. And so it's basically just a wait and see. Wait until a child may become available, and then we'll contact you. And then at that point, you can either say, yes, I want to adopt this child, or no, I don't want to adopt that particular child. And so I was waiting for to hear something about that. And I was expecting that it would be several years before I ever heard anything regarding a child becoming available. And they actually called me up one day. The adoption agency called and told me that they had a file for a 2-year old in China who had a cleft lip and a cleft palate. And they did not have any waiting families in their program who um, were uh, ready to adopt or waiting to adopt. And the way that this program in China, with China, worked was that um, for children who had special needs like medical conditions, they would send paperwork for those children out to uh, different adoption agencies that the Chinese government worked with around the world. And that um, agency would have 3 months to find a family for that child. And if they didn't find a family for that child in that time period, then the paperwork would go back to child or go back to China, and the file would be locked. And what that meant was then the child would never be adopted. So the so the so you had a 3 month period where you had a chance to be adopted by someone through special editions here in Kansas. And so as soon as they told me that they had a file for a child with a cleft palate and cleft lip for a little 2-year-old girl, I said, yes, I want her. And I didn't wait to see your paperwork or your pictures or any of your medical information. I just said, yes, I want her. And they said, well, we need to send you, all her information. We'll email it to you, and you can, look at it and read through it and have it looked at by a doctor or something, to, evaluate what you think about, her medical condition. I said, okay. And so they emailed it to me, and I was waiting at home to get the email, and computers were much slower then. But I got the email, and I opened it up, and this picture started scrolling slowly down my screen, and it was a picture of Ellie's little face. It was the one that I have of you. And I just saw that little face, and I said, there she is. It's my baby. And I knew that I was going to adopt you. There wasn't any question about it. I read all your information, but I already knew that I was going to adopt you. And so I sent I replied back to the email, and I said, yes, I want to adopt her. Lock her file so that I can adopt her. So they did that, and I had a coworker, a friend who had a cleft lip, and I could tell he had a cleft lip even though he had like a mustache, and the way he spoke, it was kind of airy, kind of wispy. So I assumed he had a cleft palate as well, but I'd never said anything to him about it. But the next day at work, I told him, I have I just got paperwork about a child who has a cleft lip and cleft palate, and I'm going to adopt her. And he said, no, don't do that. And I went, why not? And he said, because she's going to have so many surgeries. And he said, I've gone through so many surgeries. It's been awful. And he said, talk to my mom. He wanted to give me his mom's phone number so I could talk to her about how rough it had been on their family with him having to go through all those surgeries. And I just said, well, you know what? You are like one of my best friends. I didn't say this to him, but I thought to myself, you are one of my best friends. You're such a good guy. You're so smart. And you're really competent. And, even if you've had to go through all those surgeries, so what? You look at you today. You're a great guy. You're a good friend. And so this child, she'll have surgeries, but so what? We'll get through them. We'll just go through the surgeries. And then I did do some reading about cleft palate and cleft lip to get more information about what was involved in all the surgeries. And I discovered that there are some syndromes that can be involved that can cause cleft lip and cleft palate. I think one was called like Pierre-Robin syndrome, something like that. And they can also cause mental retardation and other really severe, significant physical issues. But in reading through your information, your paperwork, I don't think she has anything like that. She just has the cleft, and I think I could actually kind of tell from your paperwork that you were pretty smart. So I was pretty sure that you didn't have any kind of mental issues like that because like some of these syndromes, they're genetic issues, and so they can cause brain damage. And I wasn't going to worry about that. I just saw your little face, and I said, "That's my baby." So that was it.
So, what about the paperwork made you so sure that she didn't have any sort of genetic issues?
I really didn't know other than you seemed, and the information I had was it was not much at all. Um, I just went with my gut. I think that said that. I did send your information to the University of Minnesota Adoption Clinic, where they will evaluate the medical paperwork for a child. And when they evaluated you, they said that I think like your brain size was, your growth and your brain size were well within the US range for a normal child, which is actually unusual for a child from an orphanage in China. Usually they're much smaller. And so, and I think that they even said that you seemed to be above average from what they could tell in what they read about you. But it just confirmed what my gut had kind of told me when I read through it, you were that you were fine, and that there was nothing really to be worried about with you.
So, there's a couple things that you mentioned that I want to just quickly ask about. So, firstly, you mentioned calling these agencies and asking for more info about the child. Was that commonplace?
Yes.
Was that something they advertised that you were able to do, or did you have to like go out on a limb and ask?
Um, I think that you had like 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 a random person couldn't, you had to register with those agencies so that they knew who you were and that you weren't some weirdo who was just trying to get information about children. Um, but so it wasn't like going out on a limb. It was, I had kind of talked and registered with those agencies and given them some information about me and told them that I was, interested in adopting. And so once you did that, they would start, you could get information about children to kind of determine if you were, wanted to proceed with trying to adopt one of those children.
Did the agencies encourage you to ask about the children?
I don't know that they encourage you to ask about them, but they're trying to find homes for the children, and that was why they had these photo listings available out there. But you couldn't just like sit down and start browsing information on the children. You would have to register with the agency first, and once they had your information and knew that you were serious about adopting, then you could access the photo listing sites, and then all that would have would be like maybe a photo of the children, and a lot of them didn't have photos either. They just would have like written information saying like Sarita is an 11-year-old from India and she has a special need of like Down syndrome, something like that. So you could kind of think to yourself, do I want to ask for more information about this child?
And the other thing was, um, did the adoption agency give you resources about the special need?
No.
So that was all done independently?
Yes.
And next, I want to go into more detail about the process of adoption.
Mm-hmm.
So, what sort of things did you have to do to be cleared for adoption?
You have to provide bank statements to prove that you have enough income or enough, money that you're financially stable. I guess you have to have letters from your employer proving that showing that you're employed and that you will continue to be employed so that you can provide for the child. You have to have your house inspected. You have to get letters of recommendation from your friends and your family. You have to get a medical exam done and turn that in from your doctor indicating that you're in good health and that you're mentally stable so that you can take care of a child. what else? You have to get fingerprinted by the police and you have to have a background check done by the police to confirm that you don't have a criminal past. Um, that's most of the gist of it.
Was this done through the agency, or did you have to work with like the state government, etc.?
It's a combination of both. You get what's called a home study done, and that is done through a social worker who may or may not be part of an agency. I had mine done through a social worker that was who worked for Special Editions, and so they write up a report on you, and as part of your home study, you collect all these documents that you have to send in. So the documents are your bank statements and your letters that you have to have and your medical paperwork and your fingerprints. So you get all of that. And then it has to be what's called apostilled. And the adoption agency does that. It sends it into the federal government. And basically you have to have everything notarized by a notary public. And then the apostilles are done by the government. And so there's a considerable amount of paperwork that has to be done and processed. And that's called your dossier, I think is what they called it. And then all of that paperwork and then you also have to file for an international adoption. You have to file with the immigration services to get permission to bring the child into the country. And then depending on the country that the child is coming from, that paperwork will allow the child to become a citizen when they arrive in the country or at some later point. But you have to also guarantee that you will have the child naturalized in the country. And if you have to readopt within the country, because some states require readoption, you have to swear that you have to submit paperwork indicating that you will do that. And then after you've done that, you have to send that copies of the readoption into the adoption agency to show that you did that.
So, with regards to the paperwork that you had to fill out, was that mostly done before you travel? Did you travel abroad?
Yes.
Was that done
It all has to be done before you travel, and it's done months and months before you travel. And because all of that paperwork has to be compiled and then sent to the country, and then like in your case, an adoption from China, then that all has to be reviewed by the Chinese government, by their adoption officials, and once they review all of it, then they determine whether they will approve the adoption on their side. And so if they approve it, then at that point they'll send what they call their invitation to travel. And at that point, your adoption agency will set up the process for you to go over there to to get the child and bring the child back again. And part of that, getting the child, is the parent then has to do a lot of paperwork in that country. For you in China, I had to do a lot of paperwork there and sign off on things with government officials, and then go through immigration in the U.S. consulate in China to get all your immigration paperwork completed there in China before I could bring you back here. For India, where I adopted Sujatha, all of the paperwork I sent over there included a what do they call that when I give them authority to act in the court on my behalf? Do you remember what that's called?
Power of attorney?
Yeah, maybe it's a power of attorney.
I don't know.
But they so what happened was the director of the orphanage over there had to go to the court and basically petition the court in India to allow me to adopt Sujatha. And then once that court case had been completed in India, then There was something that was delayed, and I don't remember what it was. Um, but they so what once they do that, it's not considered a completed adoption, but they give the adoptive parent custody of the child. But the adoption is not actually completed in India, and but then eventually they'll once all the court proceedings are done there in India, then you get to go over and get the child, and then again you do more. I don't think I had to do any more paperwork in India. I just had to go get her, and then again we had to go to immigration and process her immigration paperwork and her passport to come into the United States. But when she came in, she was not a U.S. citizen, and I had to adopt her here in the United States. And then once I adopted her here, then we had to apply for her citizenship for her to become a citizen once I had done the adoption here. So it was a different sort of so it differs based on the country that you're adopting from, how it works out.
So for your daughter from China, the adoption was finalized in China, whereas
Yes.
for your daughter from India, the adoption was finalized in the U.S.
Yes.
Was there like a difference in paperwork or legal
Yes.
status between those?
Yes, there was difference in both the paperwork and the legal status.
Could you go into more detail about that?
It's been so long. Well, like I said, for the India adoption, I had to give them power of attorney for them to go into the court to speak on my behalf to the judges. Whereas in China, they don't really go to court. It's the Chinese government in charge of the adoptions make the decision on whether they'll allow you to adopt or not. And once they make that decision, then they just stamp the paperwork and it's done. And so that was different. And then again, when in China, when I went to pick you up, you were officially my child at that point. When I went to get you, you were already legally my child. And so to bring you back into the United States, I had to bring you back as a U.S. citizen. So the U.S. Immigration Service in China actually has a swearing-in ceremony for you in China, where the parents will say the oath on your behalf to swear you in. And once you get to the United States, you're legally a U.S. citizen and you're legally my child. Whereas for India, we just went and got her and just got her. She had basically, it was like a green card kind of thing. It was like a temporary permission to enter the United States. But she wasn't legally my child at that point until I had actually adopted her in the United States. So as soon as we got back, we started the proceedings. But I think we had to actually wait several months. I think there was part of the situation is that you have to wait a couple of months before you can actually do the proceedings to do the adoption here. So we had to wait several months, and then we did the adoption. And then as soon as that adoption was completed, I went ahead and applied for citizenship and got that completed as well.
So you mentioned that you were a single parent when you adopted. Was that for both adoptions?
Yes, it was.
Do you think that had any effect on the paperwork that you did?
In some respects, yes. For the adoption from China, it was more straightforward because I only had to do a set of paperwork for myself. Whereas if you were a married couple, it would be twice as much paperwork and just more difficult overall. And for India, because of the way that their culture is, I actually had applied to adopt one child as a single parent, and after I had actually applied to adopt her and sent in all of my paperwork to adopt her, the adoption agency came back to me months later and told me that the director of that orphanage had decided that they were not going to allow me to adopt her because I was single, even though it was legal to adopt as a single parent in India, this particular orphanage director decided that they were not going to let me adopt her. And then when so after that, I had to choose a different child to adopt, and so they sent in my application again for the next child, and this was to a different orphanage, and in this case, the director of this orphanage required that I have the male head of my family write a letter stating that he knew of my intention to adopt as a single parent and that he approved of it and that he would provide support for the child in the event that I was unable to support the child.
So, who did you designate as the male head of your family?
Well, I asked Uncle Steve to write that letter because I knew that Uncle Tom and Uncle Barry would not, because they didn't want me to adopt another child. And because this letter was also going to have to state that they would take care of the child if anything happened to me, I called Uncle Steve and Aunt Karen and I told them what they wanted, and I asked them if they would be willing to, take the child in the event that, anything ever did happen to me, because I wanted them to understand that, this would be something on them that they would have to take on. And they both said, yeah, sure, you bet we will. So Uncle Steve wrote the letter with Aunt Karen's blessing and said that he, approved of the adoption. So that was that.
Did Uncle Steve seem like seriously committed when he...
Yes, he was seriously committed.
And you believed it?
Yes. He would have taken you guys in a heartbeat. And I think I would have, I don't even remember who I designated as your guardians in my will at that point. But I may have actually designated Uncle Steve and Aunt Karen as your guardians because they're younger, and they have 2 kids, but they were, already Mariana's age. So, and I had a lot of life insurance, so, money-wise, they would have been able to take care of you.
Now, you mentioned that in China you had to fill out more paperwork at the consulate.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember what that was?
I don't remember exactly. It was just at the consulate. Actually, I didn't have to fill out paper at the consulate. They reviewed your immigration paperwork, and then they just signed off on it. They stamped it, and that was it. So I didn't really have to fill out any more paperwork.
Were there any issues with the paperwork you'd already filled out?
There actually was one issue, which was kind of funny because, and I think you know this because you read it in your webpage, that we were missing a page from the paperwork, and the woman from the adoption agency who was working with us in China got very upset and said I would never be able to take you out of the country because we were missing a page in the paperwork. And I said, well, why don't we just find out what we're missing and what we can do about it? And so she checked it out, and it turned out it was just a sheet that said that I promised to have you immunized when you entered the United States. And so we got that signed and notarized over at the consulate, because there was a notary over there, and that was all there was to it.
Before you had arrived there, were you concerned about the paperwork?
Yes, I was. I had multiple copies of all my paperwork, and I had a stack of it that I gave Ai to carry, and I carried my own stack of it, and I carried it with me everywhere, and I guarded it with my life, because you have to be very, very careful with all that paperwork, because if it's not all done correctly and doesn't safely make it to the consulate at the end of the trip, then you may not be able to bring the child home with you. I mean, you could probably stay there and try to get it redone and sent back out to you. But yeah, it's a big deal. You have to make sure that all that paperwork is in good shape, and you're ready to go. It's illegal. It's a legal thing, and yeah.
Was it just a concern in the general legal sense, or had you heard stories about other people's paperwork being unaccepted?
I don't think I'd really heard any. I may have heard one or two of them not being accepted, um, but I don't think it was a thing other than there was so much of it and you had to have all of it and it had to be all done correctly. So it was drilled into me when I went that how important it was.
And you mentioned that you gave some copies of this paperwork to someone named Ai.
I did.
Who's that?
My sister who went to China with me to adopt you.
Did your sister go with you to India to adopt your second child?
She did not. My niece Caitlin went. She was a college student at the time.
How did you convince her to go?
She wanted to go. She loved the thought of going to India.
So, after your first child, why did you decide to adopt a second?
Well, because I thought my first child could use a sibling. I thought she'd be lonely if she didn't have a sister or a brother. I thought mainly a sister would be good for her to have. And so that was why.
Did you seek out a child from India specifically?
Well, the main reason I ended up adopting from India was because by that time it was easier as a single parent to adopt from India because some countries had made it more difficult to adopt as a single parent. And so I knew that India was still um, fairly straightforward for single parent adoption.
Were there any specific requirements you had for this second child?
Not so much. Again, they were similar to what I had thought about for the first child, that I was hoping that, I didn't want a child with special needs that would be so severe that I wouldn't be able to work. Um, have to stay home to take care of her. And I wanted her to be younger than the first child um, I because adopting a child older than the child already in the home, it's called adopting out of birth order, and it can cause problems.
What sort of problems?
Um, well, for one thing, the child already in the home already has a place, and so you could be. It's just putting you out of order. But a thing that has happened, and I sometimes older children who have been in orphanages have been like sexually abused, things like that, and they could end up coming into the home and trying to sexually abuse the child already in the home, to repeat what's been done to them. And an older child would be stronger than you and more likely to be able to do something to you that you wouldn't be able to fight off. So that's a reason for not adopting out of birth order, to make sure that the younger child is smaller and weaker and less able to do things to you that you shouldn't be able to do.
Were these concerns something that you kind of innately had, or did you hear from people you knew, or did you read about it
I
somewhere?
read about them in the adoption mailing groups. I knew that these were things that could happen.
As far as the orphanages themselves go, did you do any research into these places before you adopted?
No, for one thing, because there is no information available, and for another thing, um, you you just don't know until a child has been identified. First of all, what orphanage the child may end up coming from, and then secondly, it's it's almost impossible to get any information about the orphanages. It's too remote from here.
Now I want to kind of fast forward to maybe the parenting side of this.
Okay.
You mentioned that your first child had special needs, a cleft palate and a cleft lip. Did your second child have special needs too?
Yes, the second child had been diagnosed with seizure disorder. That was, and part of adopting her from India and as a single parent at that point was I was pretty much in a position where I could only adopt a child with special needs as a single parent. And so I knew that I was going to have to look at children who had various disabilities or diseases. So um, when I saw her paperwork, I evaluated it and decided that it was something that we would be able to work with.
So, as a single parent having adopted two children with special needs, were any resources made available to you from like the adoption agency or the government or something like that?
No,
So, did you rely on other resources?
just the internet, just my own research.
Did you have people in like your life who were willing to help you,
In terms of researching it
or
or
just like
helping out.
in general?
Yeah, so I just had, family and friends who helped out.
When the kids were little, did you consider, or I guess rather, at what age did you consider bringing up the topic of adoption with your children?
They have always known that they're adopted, so I've always talked to them about it.
How did you explain adoption to them?
I think that I told them that for some reason their families in their birth countries were not able to take care of them. We don't know why because we don't have any information on that. And so they were placed in orphanages, and the orphanages' jobs were to try to find permanent families for those children. And so I went through the adoption agencies here in the United States who work with those orphanages to find homes for those children, and that was how they ended up being adopted.
Did either of the girls ask you questions about it?
They have asked a few questions about it. The older child, when she was little, very small, she would, if she saw an Asian woman, she would sometimes say to me, "Mom, could that be my mother? I wonder if that's my mom." So she was curious about if Asian women that she saw could be her mother, but she has never really talked about it other than that. That's the only time that she's ever evinced any type of curiosity. The younger child has convinced herself that her birth mother did not want her, and so she is unwanted, and since her birth mother didn't want her, no one should want her. So that's her take on it.
So, as a mother, how do you navigate these sort of gray areas?
Huh. Well, for the older child from China, I think that she has a good grasp on the situation in China and how she could have ended up in an orphanage, but we don't know. And I think she recognizes that. And I don't think she she doesn't seem to want to dig into the background or how she ended up there, what the circumstances were. And so I try not to push her because it's her choice to try to dig out that information if she wants that information. But I've tried to get all the information that I can get so that if she ever does want to dig, then I can help her with it. And I've gotten the information that's available as it's been available so that she can use it if she ever wants it. And for the other child, um, I can't convince her that her mother didn't want her because I don't know. And I don't know what the situation was. And the difference is for the first child, I think it would be almost impossible to ever get any information on what her background was there because there are so many people in India and because she came from a different city from the one where she was actually born. Um, it and unless somehow she could be traced through DNA, I don't know that we can ever find any background information on her. And if we did find background information, it it may be so bleak that maybe it's better not to know. But again, it's her choice. If she wants to try to look for it, then I'll do what I can to help her. For the older child, I think because of the information that we have, there's a good chance that we could find her birth family there if we wanted to, especially if we tried to do DNA testing, um, because it's a much bigger deal in China to do DNA testing, and because the circumstances in China are so different from what they were in India. In China, many parents were forced to give up their children and they want to find out what happened to those children, and so they're actively searching for those children now. Whereas in India, um, children were given up due to poverty, and those parents probably are still struggling to stay alive. And if they think about it at all, they may just think, I hope that the child I gave up is still alive and able to live a good life. But I don't know that those parents are searching, but they could be again. So if we did DNA testing, we might be able to find that family.
So, I guess more specifically, when your older daughter was asking if these Asian women that she saw on TV were her mother, how did you respond to that?
I told her that I doubted that they could be her mother because her mother would have probably been from a very small rural city in China, and the chances, and it wasn't on TV, it was actually like in stores. Like if you saw a woman in the store, you'd say, Mom, could that be my mom? And I tell her I doubted that a woman from a poor rural city in China would have been able to come over to the United States. Um, so it was just not likely to be something that would have happened.
I guess this sort of ties into my next question of being a family where both the parent and the siblings are not biologically related to one another. Um, how did that affect the way you taught them about what family is?
I don't think that it really affected it in any way, um, especially because I had seen my aunt with her two children that she had adopted, and they were just a family, and it didn't being biologically related wasn't necessarily a significant factor in that. I think the main factor in not being biologically related are things like we don't know if of any medical issues that you could have that are genetic, and because um, your different skin color and races, you will face prejudice that I have never had to face, and I don't really know how to teach you how to face that because I don't know culturally like how a Chinese family would raise their children to cope with prejudice that they would face in the United States in a predominantly, white society. And I don't know how to teach Sujatha how to face prejudice as a brown skinned person. You know, so I don't know. All I can do is say that, I think that you're going to be faced with this. I think it's people are going to do things, they're going to say things. You're going to be impacted by hateful things and ignorant things, and it's going to hurt you, and and those are things that I haven't necessarily had to deal with in my life. Um, I know that I personally have avoided things since adopting these children. Things like I would feel uncomfortable taking you guys out for a ride way out in the country because of my own beliefs, where I feel like people in the country may be more likely to be prejudiced against you versus people in big cities where they see more different cultures. So I've thought, like, if we were driving down a back road in Kansas somewhere and the car broke down, how what if we had to walk to a house and try to get help, and someone in that house said, I'm not going to let that child in here, that child's a chink, or that child's brown, you know and and I don't want to put you guys in a situation like that where something like that could happen. And so that's actually made me afraid to take you guys out in the country away from the city, where I felt fearful that those situations could happen. And that's probably my own internal prejudice against people in the country, thinking that people are more likely to behave that way. um, but it's just something that's been in there. And I've sometimes thought maybe we should move someplace that has a higher concentration of diversity, like like a city on the West Coast, like Los Angeles or Seattle, where there's more diversity, so that there's less likelihood of you guys being singled out as being minorities. So where were we on this question? I forgot.
I guess my question was about like family, but sort of related to the fears that you've been having. Do you have any fears associated, or rather, have you had any interactions where people questioned whether or not you were a family?
Not really. Once when Sujatha was tiny, we were in the grocery store and she was crying, and I actually had two black women come up to me and say, "What are you doing with that black baby? You have no business with that black baby." And I just said, "Well, she's mine." And but that's really the only time. Well, one thing that I have done is whenever we've traveled, like especially on airplanes, I've always made sure that I've had all of our adoption paperwork and copies of your passports and everything, so that I can ensure that if anyone did question if you belonged with us, that I could pull it out and say, yep, this is my kid. This is her adoption paperwork. So there's no question that she's mine and she's supposed to be with me.
So now, kind of going back to the traveling experiences, were there differences in the way that you prepared to go to China versus to go to India?
No, I don't think so. Why would there be differences?
Well, I'm just asking if there were.
No, no.
What about like your experiences in China versus in India?
Um, well, actually, I guess there were differences in how I prepared because I did a lot of reading about both countries. I wanted to know as much as I could about the history and the culture there. Um, and as far as our experiences in the country, um, in China, you could definitely tell that. Well, I guess I'd say it felt like no one would dare to break the law there. Was how I felt. Was that it was so strongly controlled, by the government that um, you really felt like there like wasn't really crime or anything around. At least that's how I felt. But it was kind of like a vacation. Whereas in India, it seemed very strange to us because the hotels that we stayed in, they all had armed guards outside them, and they had like um, high fences and gates around them. And they had guards who would open the gates to allow the cars of the guests staying in the hotels in and out. And I had no idea that India was like that, and I don't know why it was like that, but I think it was because there's more lawlessness in India, and so it was just really surprising to see all these armed guards, and they seemed like they were military or paramilitary because they were always dressed in khakis. So that was odd in India, and also I felt very disrespected in India. Um, for one thing, like we went on a trip to the Taj Mahal on our last day there, and so we had to drive a long distance to get there, and we had a guide that we had hired. So we had hired a guide, and he had a driver who was driving his car, and we stopped at a McDonald's to get lunch on the way there, and we all ordered our lunches separately, so they ordered theirs and then we ordered ours. And their food came and our food never came. And we waited and waited and waited. And I finally went up and asked about it and they finally gave us our food. But I really felt like they were not going to give us our food because we were white and we were white women. And um, I just felt like it was a very uncomfortable situation. Um, and then that was the most uncomfortable thing. And then the man who was our guide that we had hired, he was pretty jerky. I didn't like him at all. And so the whole situation, but then it's weird because we were in two places in India. We were in Chennai where we went to get Sujatha, and then we were in Delhi where we had to do the immigration paperwork. And in Chennai, we had a taxi driver that had been arranged for us through the orphanage director, and he was really really nice. He only spoke a little bit of English, but he was really nice, and he actually invited us to his home to eat dinner with his wife. His wife, wanted to make dinner for us, and he was just as nice as he could be, and so it was really nice, and I think there were much fewer Westerners in Chennai than there were in Delhi because just farther south and less, cosmopolitan. So we were more of a strange thing there in Delhi or in Chennai. And one thing that was funny was your cousin Katie. She has long blonde hair and blue eyes, and people followed her everywhere, taking her picture. And that was kind of funny. She was really uncomfortable about that. and but the people there were just they were nice. And then in in Delhi, it, we had this other guide, and he was just a unpleasant person. He was really pushy and aggressive, and we were really, I felt like, treated very poorly in second class because we were, women. And when we went to get Sujatha in in Chennai, one of the things that they happened was the director of all the orphanages and social services wanted to speak to us before we left with Sujatha, and it was just like a visit. It wasn't like anything official, but we had to go talk to him, and he started asking me about my husband and why my husband hadn't come with me on the trip. And so I just said, well, he had to work. Because I wasn't going to tell him that, I wasn't married and I had adopted her as a single child. He apparently didn't know that. So, but, the whole presumption and the way he talked to me was so, he was very, clearly, I was a second class type of human being because I was female. And so I didn't like that, but I just smiled and nodded. Smile and wave, boys. Smile and wave. That's what I kept thinking. And we got out of there. We got it done. And I didn't feel that at all in China. China just felt really nice. The people were just all so friendly, and everything there was just pleasant, and we felt like connected there, I guess. And so it was definitely a different experience. When we got home from China, we were tired, but we'd had a good trip, and it just felt like a good trip. And when we got home from India, I think Katie and I both wanted to kiss the ground. We were we're never going back. So that's the difference.
So were your guides both times arranged by the adoption agency?
No, in China they were arranged by the adoption agency, and in India the guide in Chennai was arranged by the orphanage director, but we were kind of left on our own in Delhi, and so but we had been given the name of a man who we could contact, and so that was who we used, but we were pretty much left on our own to figure out if we were even going to, we could have gone and not had a guide at all. We could have just, gone and tried to, figure things out on our own. But then there were different agencies, so that made a difference too.
So when you got back to the United States, was there more paperwork that you had to fill out?
Yes, there are what they call post-placement reports that you have to fill out every month it could be several months or it could be several years that you fill out, just kind of saying how things are going with the child and whether, just how things are going, pretty much.
These are reports that you had to fill out?
Yes, and you send them to the adoption agency, and I'm not sure if they were sent back to the adoptive country or if they just went to the adoption agency and were put in the file.
Did anyone ever come around to verify that the reports were true or accurate?
No.
There were no follow-up home studies?
Nope. Once you get the child, that's it.
Alrighty. I guess. Oh, after you had finished your adoption the first time,
mm-hmm.
and even the second time,
mm-hmm.
did you have other people who came to ask you for advice?
I don't think so. I may have had some people ask me things like on the mailing list groups. And actually I did have a family that adopted a child from Sujatha's orphanage, and they got her about 6 months later, and so we were in contact with each other. So I was telling her a lot about our experiences there, and so she knew what to expect when she got there.
Are you still in contact with that family?
We are in contact. That's Shruthi's family, remember? You know Shruthi's family. We've been there. We are.
Is that the only family really that you kept in contact with?
No, I'm actually in contact with a family that I met when I adopted my older daughter in China, and they were in China at the same time that we were adopting their daughter from the same orphanage, and so that mother and I are still in contact.
Did you coordinate travel or was it a coincidence?
No, it was just a coincidence that we both ended up there at the same time.
Did you meet up in China?
We were there at the same time, but we didn't deliberately meet up together. But yes, we were. I mean, we saw each other in the hotels and out on the street walking around.
So just to maybe make it a little clearer, when did these adoptions happen?
2005 and 2009.
And that was 2005 for the one from China?
Yes.
And 2009 for the one from India?
Yes.
Had the laws surrounding adoption or international adoption changed between the two?
They did. For one thing, adoption in China had changed significantly after 2005 because it was discovered that there had been a scandal in China where children were being basically bought and sold to orphanages for international adoption. So there were a number of new laws put in place in China to regulate adoption and the placement of children in the orphanages. And at the same time, there was, I think this was in America, America ratified a rule called the Hague Convention, which added a stronger framework around adoption, around international adoption, and it made it a lot more difficult to adopt internationally because there were so many more rules in place. And also, if you were a Hague country, then you could not adopt children from countries that were not Hague countries, which significantly decreased the number of countries that could be children could be placed from for adoption.
Were there any changes regarding like single parent versus multi-parent households?
I think that there were some rules that came into place, and in fact, in China, some of the rules that came into place were that they were significantly curtailing the number of single parents that would be allowed to adopt, and the children that they were allowing to be adopted had severe special needs for the most part. So in order to adopt from China at that point, you either had to get on a waiting list that could extend years, or you would have to adopt a child with such severe special needs that it would have made it unpracticable for a lot of single parents because they wouldn't be able to work and take care of the child at the same time.
I guess to end on a happier note, could you describe your feelings the first time you met each of your daughters in person?
Let me think. Well, when I met my older daughter, I heard a knock on the door, and I opened it up, and there she was standing there, and she was just this little girl standing there in the doorway, and she reared back when she saw me. And I think she was in shock because I don't think she'd ever seen a Caucasian person before. And so I just looked at her and I just thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's her. There she is. I was just in shock, and I couldn't pick you up or anything because you were too horrified. And they brought you in, and you were very you were just like, oh, I'm just like, I don't think I want anything to do with this person. And I just looked at you, and I looked at you, and I remember thinking, well, I know she's super smart because I just knew you were smart, and that was important to me. I don't know why. And but I couldn't, hold you or anything or until after they left, and they left you there. You cried, you screamed and cried because you were so upset being left with us, being left behind. And the our Chinese guide who was there with us said, well, let's change your clothes. That'll help her, feel better. So she wanted to change your outfit. So we changed your outfit, and you picked up your little red bag that had all your things in it, because the orphanage director had taken you shopping at Walmart. She'd bought you some things. You brought it with you, and then you're going to pick up your bag and leave. But we wouldn't let you go. We wouldn't open the door. So you sat down on I was finally able to hold you, and you were sitting on my lap, and you fell asleep. And then I could touch your little head, and I could kiss your little head, and I thought, I can kiss her head whenever I want because she's mine now. So that's how that was my thinking when I got you at first, was I could kiss your little head whenever I wanted to because you were mine. And then when we got Sujatha at the orphanage, she was all dressed up in a really fancy dress. It was all embroidered. And she peeked at us around the corner of a room. And all the other children were there in the room. And it was kind of crazy because it was a very poverty-stricken place. And a lot of the children, it was a special needs orphanage. And a lot of the children, you could tell, had significant special needs. They were blind, or they had, physical malformations in their bodies, and or they were just sitting there rocking, and that was all they could do, was just sit and rock. And we looked at that little Sujatha, and she was peeking at us and smiling, and I just thought, wow, she is just a beautiful, perfect baby. She's, especially in comparison to these other children who all had such severe special needs. She was so pretty. She was so beautiful. And she was just, she was as cute as she could be. And she looked very dainty because the orphanage director wanted to feed her lunch. And she sat her down. And Sujatha didn't eat on her own. She had been trained to sit and just be fed with a spoon. So the orphanage director was feeding her, and she was just sitting very docilely and letting herself be fed. I thought, wow, she's really quiet, and I just thought she's really quiet and docile, but she's just she's a beautiful, beautiful baby. She's just a beautiful girl. And cousin Katie said afterwards when we left, because we didn't take her home with us that day, we went to visit her, and then we went back to the hotel, and Katie said, I think we got the pick of the litter. And she really was, because she was definitely the strongest and brightest and most outgoing of the children that were in that orphanage. She was very perky. So those were my first impressions.
So I guess my sequitur into that previous question was a lie, because I've got a couple more.
Oh.
So firstly, what sort of challenges do you think you faced uniquely because you had 2 adopted children? If there were any.
I don't know that there are any challenges that are different from what other parents. You mean like two versus just one? Or
Yeah.
I don't think that there are any differences that you would have if they weren't adopted.
Okay. And then my real last question, for real this time. What advice do you have for other people who are looking to adopt?
Hmm. I think you have to be very resilient and recognize that the children that you adopt have endured trauma, and no matter how young they are when you adopt them, they have lost their mothers, and that is something that they will always have with them. They you can't take that away from them. You can't substitute yourself in that place and be their mother. You'll always be their adoptive mother. Um, they will always have a real mother out there somewhere in the world, and it's a bond that is so important and critical to children. So the best you can do is just do your best, but recognize that you will always be an adoptive parent. You'll never be their real mother. So accept that you're being given a child to parent, but it's that's the situation will never be the same as it would be if you'd given birth to that child. It doesn't mean that it can't be a great relationship and you can't have a happy family, but your child is always going to have a hurt inside of them that you cannot cure for them. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that no child should ever lose their parents. So when you adopt a child, that child should not, there should never be an expectation that that child should be grateful or thankful because you're giving them a family and giving them a home, because they've already lost everything when they lost their family and lost their home. So never think that that child should be grateful or thankful, because they've already lost everything. So just do your best to um, try to live a happy life with them, but understand that they've been hurt, and they will always have a hurt within them, whether they recognize it or voice it to you. It's something that, unfortunately, it's something that they've been given in their lives, and it's something that can't be taken away. And it may heal to a degree, but there'll always be a scar in there that um, can open up and bleed sometimes. And it's just something that you're going to have to recognize is part of them. That's all I have.
Well, thank you for your time today.